to be a very negative factor in relation to energy costs as a consequence of the price that has been agreed by the United Kingdom Government.
Thank you. Before we move to the next item of business, members will wish to join me in welcoming to the gallery ambassadors and high commissioners representing members of the Association of South East Asian Nations. Thank you. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. Does the First Minister still have full confidence in his Justice Secretary?
First Minister. Joanne Lamont.
There you go, no surprise there. Presiding Officer, I welcomed the Government's interest in corroboration because, like many others in this chamber, I have genuine concerns about whether it achieves justice for every victim, particularly women. But it has become clear through the passage of this legislation that the process has been flawed and serious reservations have not been addressed. So I believe the Cabinet Secretary has taken the right decision in delaying these plans. But then, I also thought it was the right decision 6 weeks ago when my colleague Graham Pearson, formerly one of Scotland's most senior police officers, suggested this course of action. Can I remind the First Minister of Kenny MacAskill's considered response to that suggestion 6 weeks ago? He said, "We know that Labour members take their cue from Cameron and Osborne." He continued, "Labour has sold its soul and is in danger of selling out the victims of crime." So does the First Minister agree with his Cabinet Secretary that previous moves to delay this legislation were part of a Tory-led conspiracy, or was it just the right thing to do?
First Minister.
Well, it's certainly true that it was very difficult to reconcile Labour's manifesto commitment to look at the matter of corroboration with the position that the Labour Party were adopting with regard to the Criminal Justice Bill. Removing the general law of corroboration from Scotland in the practice is going to, we believe, secure access to justice for hundreds of people who otherwise are denied by the present situation, when cases cannot be brought to trial because they don't have that standard of corroboration which is unique within the Scottish criminal justice system. And that's why the moves that Kenny MacAskill made and this Government proposed to look again at the general law of corroboration, to remove it and to put in place the standard of evidence as opposed to the quantity of evidence has been widely welcomed by the organisations who care most about the people who suffer most from this situation: Rape Crisis Scotland, Victims Support Scotland. Now, this week, the three opposition parties asked at the Bureau, as I understand it, if we could look again at delaying the legislation until after Lord Bonamy's review group reported. And the Justice Secretary acceded to that request. Now, given that was done, would it not be gracious and reasonable for the Labour Party to try and focus on the issue that hopefully all of us want to secure, and that is access to justice for people who have been subjected to some of the vilest crimes in Scotland?
Joanne Lamont.
Well, I think the First Minister, if he was serious about that, would be addressing the fact that the Cabinet Secretary's response to people who raised concerns was to impugn the motives of those who were doing so. I ask him again to reflect on what the Cabinet Secretary's response to the Labour Party's request for delay was. The gap between that and what the First Minister now says could not be greater. So let's look at the process from the start. When the Criminal Justice Scotland Bill was introduced, senior legal figures raised valid concerns about corroboration. These were dismissed by the Justice Secretary, who told his party conference, "Laws are made by Parliament, not one profession. This is not a debate between learned legal friends." When the Justice Committee raised more concerns, Kenny MacAskill came up with a genius idea: set up an expert group to scrutinise the bill, which will report after the legislation was passed, after the Kenny MacAskill's disgraceful performance in this chamber 6 weeks ago, and this embarrassing climb down. I ask the First Minister in all seriousness, does he believe that this has been an appropriate way to take through legislation on an issue of this importance?
First Minister.
I think this government is taking forward legislation because we believe, absolutely believe, the issue is of vital importance. That has been our motivation for taking forward this legislation, because we've listened to the arguments and indeed the pleas of the organisations that I listed. But I can't help contrast the observations of Joanne Lamont on this issue compared to the organisations who have been campaigning and putting forward and supporting the government's attempts to redress this injustice. The welcome from Rape Crisis Scotland about the continuing commitment that this government has to remove the general law of corroboration. The welcome from Victims Support Scotland. Annabel Goldie described yesterday the Cabinet Secretary's decision as courageous. And I think she didn't do that in a Sir Humphrey way, she did it in a genuine way. So when this government, which has a majority in this Parliament, listens to the arguments put forward by the opposition parties and tries to get the maximum unity behind our proposal, then isn't it reasonable that, given our bona fides on this issue and the desire we have to access justice for the victims of crime, that should have a general welcome and support? That is the determination of this government to redress this situation, and that is exactly what we are going to do.
Joanne Lamont.
It is precisely because I care so deeply about these issues that we were determined that we build a consensus on making such a decision. And that is why the Cabinet Secretary's hostility to anyone who disagreed with him was so inappropriate. I ask the First Minister to go back again and look at what his Cabinet Secretary said 6 weeks ago and ask whether that was an appropriate way to conduct himself, because this, of course, is not Kenny MacAskill's first mess. His sectarianism legislation was described as mince and horribly drafted, and his police reforms have ended up in an embarrassing turf war. Now, while I believe the decision announced this week was the right one, this Parliament still has a problem. We do have to find a way of building a consensus to address the issues of corroboration and low conviction rates of rape. The Labour Party from the beginning has said that we would do so. But given Kenny MacAskill's approach and expressed hostility to those who raised genuine concerns about what he was doing, does the First Minister really believe it is possible for this Parliament to reach that critical consensus on corroboration with Kenny MacAskill as Cabinet Secretary?
First Minister.
Well, in terms of accepting Lord Bonamy's review group and its role and the detailed examination that he is going to give the issue and helping people towards acceptance and building that consensus, yes, of course. Do I believe that the Labour Party will look upon this issue as being an issue in itself? Probably not. But the consensus that Kenny MacAskill is building is across Scottish society. And that consensus, as we see, well, if I could say to Joanne Lamont, it's precisely because we care about this issue so much that we pursued this legislation with such vigour, and we shall continue to pursue this legislation with such vigour. But I am interested in the question she asks about the confidence I have in this Justice Secretary. I'll tell you why I've got confidence in this Justice Secretary. Because we have 1,000 extra police in the streets and communities of Scotland thanks to this Justice Secretary. The recorded crime in Scotland is down by 35% thanks to this Justice Secretary. That violent crime is down by almost a half under the office of this Justice Secretary, and crimes of handling offensive weapons are down by 60%. And above all, that people's fear of crime is dropping in Scotland for the first time. And all of these comparisons under this Justice Secretary are comparisons with when the Labour Party was last in government. And the people of Scotland, knowing and appreciating these things, know that this government has discharged its responsibilities to the communities of Scotland in a way that no previous devolved administration managed. And the real issues that matter to the people are contained in these vital statistics. So when we address the general rule of cooperation, we shall do it on the basis of giving justice to the victims of crime. And that, again, will be the performance against which this government and this Justice Secretary is run.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, in February, the Justice Secretary gave a speech which many people, including SNP members, considered to be the most ill-judged and intemperate in the history of this Parliament. In it, he claimed that those with principled objections to the abolition of a key tenet of Scots law were part of nothing more than a unionist conspiracy. His performance was shameful to watch. So let's try this again. Now that the Justice Secretary has been forced into a climb down, does the First Minister accept that Kenny McCaskill's claim that opposition parties were selling out the victims of crime because of our constitutional beliefs was as wrong as it was offensive?
First Minister.
I can't help but contrast what Ruth Davidson has just said with the statement that was issued by Annabel Goldie yesterday. Annabel Goldie, in her statement yesterday, the spokesperson for the Conservative Party in this issue, welcomed the statement of the Justice Secretary, welcomed that the requests of the opposition parties would be met, and said it took no little courage to make such a statement. Now, what has happened between that generous welcome on the issue yesterday and the remarks just said by Ruth Davidson today? Many of us in this Parliament, if we are to take a canvass opinion, rather like today's when Annabel Goldie was sitting where Ruth Davidson was, and Ruth Davidson didn't have the leadership of her party.
Ruth Davidson.
The difference, First Minister, is that I have never doubted the Scottish Government's concern for victims of crime in this matter, just as your government should never have doubted ours. But, Presiding Officer, we have been here before. The First Minister has been forced to stand there and defend his Justice Secretary's handling of McGrahy. He's been forced to defend his Justice Secretary's handling of the single police force. He's now being forced to defend his Justice Secretary on corroboration. This is the same Justice Secretary who's had bills for minimum pricing and court reform taken off his desk and handed to other ministers. This Justice Secretary's judgment is now openly questioned by his colleagues as well as his opponents. His judgment that the case to abolish corroboration has been made cannot be taken at face value. The First Minister now has an opportunity to restore some of the credibility lost by Kenny McCaskill's handling of this case. He can do that by extending the remit of Lord Bonamy's review to consider whether corroboration should be abolished at all. Will he?
First Minister.
So now we get to the nub of the issue, that the request to delay the legislation so that Lord Bonamy's review group could report and look at the safeguards that were necessary to make the abolition of the general rule of corroboration more widely acceptable wasn't really that at all as far as the Conservative Party were concerned. It was actually the root and branch opposition to the abolition of the general rule of corroboration. And therefore, what I'd say to Ruth Davidson, yes, of course, you can have an opposition to abolishing the general rule of corroboration, but you cannot do that and do as Murdo Fraser did on television, complain about cases not being brought to court, when that particular vile case was exactly an example of a case that could not be brought to court because of the general rule of corroboration. You cannot have it both ways in the Conservative Party. You can't say you want cases brought to court, you want justice for the victims of crime, and then say, look, we're opposed root and branch to this necessary reform. That is why this government, in listening to the victims of crime, is doing exactly the right thing. I believe we're doing the right thing in acceding to the request to let Lord Bonamy's review group report so as we can further build that consensus for necessary reform. That is the substance of the issue. And I have enormous confidence in a Justice Secretary who has delivered the lowest levels of recorded crime for over a generation, who has put 1,000 extra police on the streets of communities of Scotland, and where recorded crime is down by 35% on the issues that matter to the people of Scotland. That is the performance of this Justice Secretary.
I have a constituency supplementary from Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. On the 30th of January, First Minister, I raised my concerns with regard to an outbreak of norovirus in the Borders General Hospital in my constituency. I regret to inform the First Minister that 3 months down the line, that outbreak remains and there's a ward closed to admissions and other restrictions in place. Does he share my concerns about what appears to be a great delay in resolving this?
First Minister.
Well, I share very much the concern of the local member on norovirus and the prevalence of reports in the Borders General. She does know, of course, that norovirus, in terms of the general application across Scotland, is in a significantly better position than it was, for example, last year. But nonetheless, it is obviously of key concern that in this particular instance has not shown that general improvement. And the Health Secretary will offer a meeting with Christine Graham to take forward any further action that can be taken in order to resolve this situation.
Question number 3, Jamie Hepburn.
To ask the First Minister what measures the Scottish Government is putting in place to tackle food poverty.
First Minister.
Well, the Trussell Trust report that 71,000 people used food banks in Scotland in the last financial year, a fivefold increase in the previous year, and over 17,000 children have received assistance from Scottish food banks. That is unacceptable. Why so many people have to rely on emergency food provision in our rich country.
Jamie Hepburn.
Thank the First Minister for that answer. Last year, the UK Government wrote to Glasgow City Council making the incredible claim that the improved reduction in food waste by supermarkets was one of the drivers in the growth in onward food banks. And Lord Freud, the Minister for Welfare Reform, has repeatedly stated there is no link between his reforms and food bank use. Does the First Minister agree with me that this is symptomatic of a Westminster system detached from reality, and it is outrageous that UK ministers have come up to Scotland today to lecture us on welfare when it is their welfare reforms that have caused the dramatic increase in the use of food banks here in Scotland, now used by tens of thousands of families with children in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, Jamie Hepburn will know that just earlier this month the Government announced an extra £1 million for an emergency food action plan to help combat food poverty in Scotland, including $500,000 for emergency food aid. He also knows that we're investing at least £260 million over the period to 2015-16 to try and limit the damage of the imposition of welfare cuts, and we will continue as a government to help the vulnerable wherever and whenever we can. But in terms of his general point, I listened to the radio this morning and I heard the Secretary of State for Scotland describe the welfare system that's being applied by this government in the following terms, quote, "This is a fantastic system which provides support from some of the most vulnerable people in our communities." This from a Secretary of State speaking for Better Together, the campaign encompassing the Tories, Liberals and the Labour Party, speaking for Better Together as an explanation of the parties which are dismantling the welfare state in this country, which have driven people into food banks across Scotland, actually arguing it's a fantastic system. That's not just out of touch with the truth, it's out of touch with reality.
Question 4, Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to address the gender equality gap.
First Minister.
Well, it's totally unacceptable that women still face inequality in significant areas of their life, and this Government's ongoing commitment to tackling that gender inequality through the allocation of resources and the range of activity we've undertaken since taking office. It should be said there are good signs. The female employment rate in Scotland is now 69.4%. That's higher than any other UK nation. The inactivity rate is now the lowest. 52% of full-time college students are female, and 43% of those starting a modern apprenticeship in 2012-13 were women, up from 27% in 2008-9. But all of us should agree there is much still to be done. And that's why we're consulting on women's representation in public boards, and why on the 9th of June we'll host a women-only Scottish Cabinet event to provide a forum for the gender equality organisations of Scotland to discuss the opportunities for women in an independent Scotland.
Christina McKelvey.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? The First Minister will no doubt be aware there has been much talk from anti-independence politicians this week on the supposed, obviously fantastic benefits of having decisions on welfare and pensions made at Westminster, except of course for Ian Duncan-Smith, who couldn't even front his own policy and come to Scotland today to make the announcement. What they have all been silent on is how women have been particularly hard hit by Westminster's welfare cuts and will be likely to come with cuts. Can the First Minister assure the Chamber that, with the powers of independence, the Scottish Government will use every means at its disposal to make Scotland a fairer and more equal society?
First Minister.
Well, the child tax and working tax changes will hit 110,000 households in Scotland. 88% of them will be couples with children. The bedroom tax has hit 72,000 households, 80% of whom have a person with a disability in the household. And yet, after this government taking the action required to mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax in Scotland, we are still waiting, after repeated requests, for the acceptance by Westminster that what we are doing is appropriate and within our powers. So even when we are devoting the resources of Scotland to protect the people of Scotland from the bedroom tax, we can't even get a letter back from the current Westminster Government. And that makes it untenable, not just for the Tory Liberal coalition, but for those on the Labour benches who argue not that welfare couldn't be implemented in an independent Scotland, but shouldn't be implemented in an independent Scotland. And unless and until the Labour Party disavows that attitude from Jackie Baillie, and then they'll be stuck and guilty by association with what is happening from Westminster under the Tory Liberal alliance.
Jackie Baillie.
Isn't it interesting that we waited a year for the SNP to take action on the bedroom tax? And the SNP record... The SNP record on gender equality is not good. Isn't it the case that the SNP have slashed places at colleges? Isn't it the case that the SNP have slashed jobs in the public sector, all having a disproportionate impact on women? And isn't it the case that the SNP have failed to deliver gender balance on the boards of public bodies, failed to meet your own 40% target for the number of applications from women, and spent a grand total of some £3,000 on advertising to promote public appointments? I can't help but contrast that with the over £1 million spent on promoting the White Paper on independence. Isn't it the case, First Minister,
I think we've got a number of questions here, Ms Baillie.
Talk a good game, but have actually improved the lives of women?
I offer Jackie Baillie just two statistics. Well, that was a kind of delayed reaction from the Labour benches. Can I offer Jackie Baillie just two statistics, 14% and 40%. 14% was the number of women percentage in Gordon Brown's cabinet when he left office. 14, that is 14%. 40% is the number of women now in the Scottish cabinet in Scotland. But is Jackie Baillie now totally unaware that employment in Scotland is now at an all-time record, and driving that increase in employment in Scotland has been the sharp rise in employment of women, mostly in full-time jobs? Can she not find it in her heart to welcome the improvement of the figures, to welcome the fact that Scotland now has the highest women's employment rate of any country in these islands? And doesn't she think it might be something to do with the work of this government and the STUC in promoting exactly that? And does she not think it's somewhat surprising, not that we're only at 42% of women entering modern apprenticeships, but the level we inherited from the Labour Party of 27%. So just as 40% is better than 14%, 42% is a lot better than 17%.
Question number 5, Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. to ask the First Minister what discussions the Scottish Government has had with Glasgow City Council concerning the future of the site of the Red Road flats following the demolition of the existing buildings.
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I think it's worth noting the constructive manner in which Patricia Ferguson, as local member, responded to the concerns surrounding the Red Road flats in the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony, which of course primarily affected her constituents. I mean, Red Road is one of 8 transformational regeneration areas in Glasgow, which affects some of the most deprived areas of the city. The Government is part of the partnership of Glasgow Council and the Glasgow Housing Association that administer the work in these transformational areas.
Patricia Ferguson.
I thank the First Minister for his answer, but does he agree with me that suitable alternative accommodation should be found for the asylum seekers living there as quickly as is possible, and that all agencies in the city and the Scottish Government should now work collaboratively with the local community to prioritise a dynamic and innovative regeneration of the 22-acre Red Road site following demolition of the towers in a way that benefits the communities of Balornock and Vermulloch?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that, and I agree incidentally with the first part of the question. But I know that the local member knows that the transformational regenerate areas and the partnership which applies them have done excellent work across major areas in Glasgow. I mean, there's been investment from the Government alone of £30 million in the construction of new homes in Toryglen, at Gallagate, Maryhill and at Lauriston. And I'm certain that that partnership, that's the partnership between the Council, the Glasgow Housing Association and the Government which administers this, will be coming forward with good ideas in terms of the Red Road site. And I know that they'll want to have the widest possible consultation locally to see that acceptance of the regeneration proposals, including, of course, with the local Member of Parliament.
Question 6, Kenneth Gibson.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's assessment is of labour market conditions in Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, I'm delighted that Kenneth Gibson's asked this question, because it's very significant that the opposition parties don't want to talk about their latest labour market data, which showed that employment levels at their highest in history in Scotland, 2,575,000 people now employed. The employment level has increased by 68% over the year, driven by an increase of 46,000 in female employment. Scotland continues, of course, to have the highest employment rate, a lower unemployment rate and the lowest inactivity rate of any nation of these islands.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for his reply. The recent Bank of Scotland report on jobs shows Scotland's labour market is continuing to recover and strengthen. Does he agree that if Scotland can be relatively successful with the limited powers of devolution, that we can achieve so much more with the full powers of independence? And can you advise the Chamber what economic initiatives the Scottish Government will introduce following independence to cut unemployment in Scotland and make it a more prosperous and more equal society?
First Minister.
Can I commend the member, indeed all members of this chamber, to the document released last November, not just in the White Paper, but the document on the economy, which set forward a range of initiatives to power the Scottish economy and employment market trends forward. But I did hear, I think I heard it right, it certainly was greeted with the appropriate amount of laughter, a comment from the Tory benches to say that this remarkable success in terms of the employment figures in Scotland was to the credit of George Osborne. Now, is that the same George Osborne who just over 2 years ago said in an interview in the north east of Scotland that he knew that international companies were hesitating to come to Scotland because of the incoming referendum? Of course, he was striving and doing his best as Chancellor to disavow them of that opportunity. Since then, we've had record levels of inward investment in Scotland. So, if that is the forecasting prowess of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the very last thing even a Tory should do is try to claim the credit for these excellent job figures in Scotland.
Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister said that the Scottish Government has limited economic powers. So how much credit can he realistically take for record growth, record employment and low unemployment.
First Minister.
In that brief period before Mr Brown's replacement by Mr Johnston as a Tory economic spokesman, can I give him this explanation? The interesting thing about the figures is the contrast and the movement forward and the differential between the Scottish figures and the rest of the UK.
Order.
Well, I think it's of interest to the people of Scotland that we have record employment figures in Scotland. I think it's a reasonable comparison to say if the UK government were to implement some of the fantastic policies pursued by this government, like the small business bonus, like, for example, Mr Swinney's decision to protect capital investment in Scotland despite the swingeing cuts of Alec Johnston's hero. If they pursued just some of these policies, then of course they perhaps would be in a different position to what they are. But I think it's a reasonable position for this government to take, that if we can achieve that record level with the limited powers of this Parliament, then with all the economic levers at our disposal, there will be even greater success in the job markets in Scotland.
That ends First Minister's questions. That ends First Minister's questions. We are now moving to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.